Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program webinar series. Thanks for joining us today. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, and the City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'm Marcia Nelson, an Executive Fellow at the School of Public Policy, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. This series is part of the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program at the School of Public Policy, which is exploring the potential of this ambitious concept. You can find out more about the research program by visiting our website at www.canadiancorridor.ca. Today, we're going to dive into the financing and funding approaches for the establishment, governance, and regulatory oversight of the Canadian Northern Corridor. We'll have plenty of time for questions following the presentation, so please do submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can. So let's jump right into the presentation. I'd like to welcome Tony Boardman, a professor emeritus at the Sauder School of Business at the University of British Columbia. Mark Moore, senior lecturer for Simon Fraser University's Beatty School of Business, and Aidan Vining is the Emeritus CNABS Professor of Business and Government Relations at Simon Fraser University. Welcome, everyone. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Marcia. Okay, I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And I'll give the presentation. This is joint research, as Marcia said, with Aidan Vining and Mark Moore. And they're online and they will answer all the difficult questions. But to begin, I'll start the presentation. So I'm just going to hit screen share and you should be able to see my slides. Okay, so as the slide says, is that the purpose of this research is to examine financing and funding options for the establishment, governance, and regulatory oversight of the Canadian Northern Corridor. So what we want to do is just to begin with some background information. So let me. Okay, well, sorry, I went too far. Okay, just some, make sure we're on the same page, is to emphasize that this Canadian Northern Corridor would span multiple jurisdictions from the west to the east and branches to the far north. So that's certainly an important characteristic of this corridor to bear in mind. It will also be multimodal, with involving roads, railways, pipelines, electricity transmission, and communications. So it's a multiple jurisdiction, multimodal corridor. We basically think that the main rationale for a single organization to handle this multimodal, multi-jurisdictional corridor is that this is basically one organization, because it's a lot less costly for one organization to develop a multimodal corridor than it is to separately develop a bunch of single mode corridors. So there's an efficiency rationale and of course an equity rationale. Now we focus on financing and funding, and you might wonder, well, what's the difference? So we use the term in the following ways. That is, financing is basically raising the money to get the project going. So you need to raise financial resources, in particular to assemble the rights of way that the CNC will occupy, and then to build and operate the various infrastructure components. So you need financing up front to set the organization. You also need financing to actually build the infrastructure. Now, private financiers and probably public financiers as well want to get their money back that they've invested and ideally to earn a return on their investments. So the question is, who ultimately is going to pay for it? So this is the funding. Where do the funds come from to pay the financiers to compensate them, pay them back and compensate them for the risks that they've incurred from their financing? So the funders are the ultimate payers for the corridor. So we have to look at both financing and funding. Now, before we get into that, it's important to identify some other major participants. Traditionally, if infrastructure providers, a pipeline, for example, wants to build a pipeline, they contract directly with the current holders of the rights of way. Sometimes that's reasonably straightforward, and as we know, often it's not. Now, the CNC, this basically Canadian Northern Corridor, is more complicated. So we have to identify who the key agents or participants are. So most importantly, there's this organization that we've called the assembler. And they are the key agent that really intermediates between the current property rights holders and the eventual rights holders. That is, those who actually provide the infrastructure. So they're the builder operators. So the assembler is this key agent between these two groups. The assembler chooses the routes, presumably within consultation with the infrastructure providers, and assembles the rights of way, puts them together from the property rights holders through purchase, gifting, or some other form of compensated or uncompensated expropriation. So the rights of way are then assigned to the infrastructure providers through sale, gifting, or some other contractual arrangement. And then the infrastructure providers build and operate the various modes and provide services to the end users. So what we do now is basically to put all of these key participants together in a model of the multimodal corridor. So if you sort of focus on the middle part of it to begin with, on the left-hand side, you see the initial property rights holders. They may be private, provincial, federal, varies. And then we have the assembler, which plays this key role in the middle in terms of assembling those rights of way, and then basically providing those rights to the infrastructure providers, which are on the right-hand side. The infrastructure providers could be government or private sector, and they provide the infrastructure that are used by the users on the right-hand side. Now, the assembler, of course, is going to receive input from all sorts of people, but certainly they'll be negotiating with the initial property rights holders, the potential infrastructure builders, entities with constitutional rights, such as Indigenous peoples, and with regulators. So in order to do this, they're going to need financing. So that's the sort of the financing arrow at the top of the diagram. So once they've got those property rights and they're handed over to the infrastructure providers, they are also going to need financing to build whatever infrastructure it is that they intend on building. And they also will receive input and guidance from regulators. So we assumed that the regulatory arrangements will really not change, and that the current existing Canadian regulatory bodies would remain in effect. And then on the right-hand side, of course, ultimately somebody's got to pay for all this. It might be the end users themselves through access fees or tolls or something like that, or it might be the government. Now, basically the assembler itself, we think, is most likely the federal government or a consortium of governments involving Indigenous peoples as well. We considered that it might be a private sector entity, but we think it's probably a government assembler. The government assemblers like to have lower costs of consortium negotiation, governance, and financing. They have the power of expropriation, which a private provider probably doesn't have. And they'd probably have lower costs negotiating with provincial infrastructure providers. And one of the parts of our report was to engage in some case studies. And basically, in the case studies that we looked at, they were either governmental or supra-governmental, like the EU. And there's some evidence that really sort of multi-jurisdictional or multi-government consortiums are more successful than just a single government assembler. All right, so that's a little bit about the assembler. But before we get into financing and funding, we need to think a little bit about what the goals are. So we are economists. We're really sort of believers in social welfare. And so in our view, the primary goals of this corridor should be economic efficiency and equity. So economic efficiency attempts to maximize the net social benefits, the net benefits to society as a whole. And we think that the corridor as a whole and the various sub-projects, the different infrastructure projects, should be economically efficient. That is, should have positive net social benefits. But of course, equity is also an important consideration in this whole project. Okay, so that's sort of by way of background. And so now we're going to go through the process, sort of looking back at figure 1, going from left to right. So the first thing that this, well, after getting some financing, the first thing that the assembler is going to have to do is to acquire the rights of way. Some may be transferred at no cost. The assembler might have to purchase them or lease some fraction back. And of course, it does have the right of expropriation if it's a government agency. We caution that the transaction costs of acquiring these really many rights from many diverse holders are likely to be high and progress slow. So it's not going to be something that happens overnight. Now, where's the money going to come from? Well, basically, we think it's the federal government is going to operate this assembler. They'll be behind it. Where is the money going to come from? Well, they can cut other expenditures. They can increase taxes or borrowing. Borrowing sort of postpones the problem because it's going to require increased taxation in the future. If it's a multiple government assembler, then non-federal governments might provide co-financing. But again, there are going to be transaction costs. This is going to involve multi-party negotiations, and as in any multi-party negotiation, each party has an incentive to try to get everybody else to pay for it and to free ride on their contributions. Okay, now, how is it going to get funded? So how is it going to get paid back? Well, it can get paid back by charging access fees to the infrastructure providers for their rights to build and operate the infrastructure. And the fees charged could be fees charged to end users. And basically in both sides, it could be access fee. An access fee is a fixed amount paid for access, for the right to consume any amount of service. Or it could be a user charge, like a toll, based on how much of the service is consumed. And of course, it can be funded by government tax revenues. including value capture, which we talk a little bit about later. Now, in terms of charging the infrastructure providers access fees, first of all is that they're not going to pay anything unless they expect to earn positive economic profits up front. So they have to be profitable really before you can charge them. If they don't have any money, they're not going to pay. So again, they could be charged once and for all up front, an access fee, or a periodic basis, typically annually. And basically is that because the social discount rate is lower for the government, for the social society, than for private firms, in our view, annual access fees are preferable from a societal perspective. Now, it's possible that the infrastructure providers are unregulated. So, in fact, is that if they were unregulated, then they could price at monopoly prices. They would make more money, and it would probably be possible for the assembler to basically charge them higher fees. So an unregulated monopolist can basically figure out how much it's willing to pay for a corridor access based on the information it has. And it's possible to have a number of potential infrastructure providers, in which case the assembler could hold an auction for the rights to access, and in the process be able to extract most of the potential willingness to pay and profits from these infrastructure providers. So while that's great from the financial point of view of the assembler, it's not so good for users, because they'll basically typically charge the users a high price, and so the infrastructure will be inefficiently utilized. That is, there won't be enough essentially users on it compared to what would be optimal. Now, in terms of funding the assembler with user fees, which is certainly one possibility. So if the infrastructure providers don't have the money, you could charge the end users, and it could be a usage charge. However, again, if you impose a usage charge, you raise the price, and typically it would be above the marginal cost, which would be socially inefficient. Or the assembler could collect an access fee per period on its behalf, and then service could be provided at the typically a regulated zero profit level. So we sort of like that outcome the best, and it would result in a reasonably efficient outcome from society's point of view. Now, often with these projects is that there's a claim made that because of the greater economic activity and all the value creation, there'll be higher GDP, there'll be more money, and basically is that some of that will be captured by taxes. So this is called value capture. So the tax will increase, basically tax the increased economic activity. And this could be done in a variety of ways. It could be on individuals, corporate incomes, sales taxes, royalties on extracted resources, and property revenues. So that's one possibility. Again, we caution that with multiple jurisdictions, which are likely to be in place here, there may be some tricky negotiations on who's going to pay what, and therefore on basically on how to fund the assembler from these taxes. Now, moving to the right of our diagram, back to figure 1, to the right of the assembler, we have the infrastructure providers. And basically, who are these infrastructure providers? Well, they might be private for-profit firms, as long as, and they'd be interested as long as they can have enough revenue to cover their costs. So railways, pipelines, electricity, telecommunications. They might be state-owned enterprises, that is government firms, crown corporations, as we call them in Canada. They might be mixed public-private enterprises, sometimes known as hybrids. Or basically they could be done by PPPs. So typically a government agency may contract with a private sector firm to partially finance, build, and operate the infrastructure for a contracted period, typically 20 to 30 years. So there's a variety of potential infrastructure providers. How is the financing and funding going to work? Well, first of all, we discuss roads because they're one of the modes expected on this corridor. And they're a little bit different because for the reasons that we outline here. So typically for providing roads, it's either government provision or a public-private partnership. So traditional provision, right, involves contracting out the design build. So private sector firms will actually do the work, but basically under a contract and ideally a fixed price contract, so that the private sector basically bears the construction risk. And that's financed by the government from higher taxes, reduced spending or borrowing. Then in terms of funding, basically it might be funded by tolls. However, that might not be efficient, which is our last point down there, is that if the corridor is uncongested, the economically efficient toll is close to zero. So you're not going to get much toll from users. So roads generally, therefore, are going to be funded by government. The other alternative is to use a PPPs, and basically is that an argument for PPPs is that they may be more technically efficient. However, is that the same incentives can arise if you have a fixed price design build contract with the private sector. So there's no reason necessarily to use PPPs for technical efficiency. And there are a number of problems. So most important is that the private financiers face a higher risk-adjusted cost of capital than government. So therefore, it's going to be more expensive because they're only going to do it if they basically are compensated to cover the higher risk-adjusted cost of capital. And secondly, PPPs really don't like to bear revenue risk. So they only really want to bear the design build risk. And if that's all they really want to bear, why don't you do it by a design build contract rather than a PPP contract, which pays them back over a long period of time. Another reason, argument against PPs is that they have high transaction costs. And finally, there are few private sector businesses that can actually do the work involved. And so few bidders result. And as we know, is that there are a few bidders that often results in high government payments. Now, how else might we fund the infrastructure? Well, private equity is one possibility. And indeed, some very large infrastructure projects have been at least partially financed by private equity. And this includes the Suez Canal and the Channel Tunnel underneath the channel. However, private equity investors are risk averse, and they certainly prefer projects that are already in operation with less revenue risk. Potentially another source of funds are public pension funds, but again, they don't want to bear the design risk, and they like predictable cash flows. So if there are availability payments where the government guarantees cash flows and they can earn a nice rate of return, they're happy to put up the money. But again, it raises the risk of why is the government doing this? Why doesn't it just finance it itself, which would be cheaper? Now, the other thing we did was to do some look at some evidence from other countries or within Canada, but also outside of Canada, to see if we could find any magic solutions to these issues of financing and funding. So there's a number of points we found is that government organizations are always the assembler, and governments basically always finance the assembler. Infrastructure, as far as we know, and it is difficult to get some information, private firms actually build the infrastructure. Where does the money come from? Well, it comes from governments, comes from multilateral organizations such as the European Union, or development banks like the Asian Development Bank provide most of the financing. As we said, there was a PPP, the Channel Tunnel was a PPP, involved private individuals putting up some money, the infrastructure providers putting up some money. That went bankrupt. User fees, mostly user charges, fund most projects. Not necessarily 100%, but any money, there certainly is that user fees are often employed on projects. And of course, where these fees are insufficient, then the government may provide additional funding. The Slave Geological Province Corridor Project, SGP, expects some government value capture through royalties and taxes. So this is a mining, it's a road for a mining project, for a mine. So in summary, putting together this corridor involves many participants, financiers, the funders, the rights of way holders, the assembler, infrastructure providers, users, regulators, indigenous groups, and so on. So transaction costs are going to be high. We think that the key players here are the assembler and the infrastructure providers. The assembler basically assembles the property rights and transfer them to the infrastructure providers. How are they going to be financed? Well, they're probably going to be government, and they're probably going to be financed really by governments. Government fund these things by reducing other expenditures, increasing taxes, or borrowing. How might they be funded? Well, they might be funded by access fees or user fees to the infrastructure providers or to the end users. There might be some taxes, or ultimately it's going to be financed and funded by government. In terms of infrastructure providers, they're going to be financed, they're going to finance themselves, right? Or again, they may be financed through government, PPPs, private equity, public pension funds. They're all possible sources of financing rather. And the funding, some funding will be through access charges or user fees charged to end users, or again, funded by the government. So that's a brief summary of our presentation. The final page I'm not going to go through, but if you're interested, there is a summary of the evidence that we found in the case studies on the last page. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Marsha to lead the Q&A period.
Thanks, Tony. That was terrific. And now there are just so many questions and a lot to talk about. So when you think about this kind of project, I mean, it's a massive undertaking from the rights of way acquisition through construction and then operation. And one of our audience members saw an estimate in 2016 that placed the cost at around $100 billion. And they wondered if anyone had a ballpark estimate here in 2020 for what this kind of undertaking could cost.
I'm happy for my co-authors to jump in at any time. So if they'd like to turn on their microphones, Mark, that would be good. We didn't look at the cost of this because we really don't know really much about it in terms of exactly what infrastructure will be provided. So we didn't even attempt to look at costing. So I have no idea.
I'm happy to make one general comment. There are two very different ways of looking at the cost. One is to think in terms of nominal dollars, which, given that this is a very long-term project, obviously is problematic, but it is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it in terms of the net present cost, where we're looking at the whole time horizon and bringing back the cost in terms of real dollars to the current date. The main point is that those two different ways of looking at will give you very different numbers, and people often get confused as to which one they're being told about. So although we don't have a number, we should keep that in mind, that nominal cost in over time as against the net present cost in real inflation adjusted dollars will be very different. I don't know if Mark wants to jump in and add something on that.
No, I just saw that the second part of the question was relating to the priority of the government in a post-COVID world, and I actually don't have anything to say about that other than it does seem to be a phenomena that's being experienced right now, that because of the relative values of saving and investment across the globe, that the cost of borrowing for governments now is extremely low. If you look out even sort of 10-year government yields on bonds right now are so low that they are below the expected rate of inflation, which essentially means that savers are willing to pay governments to hold their wealth for them. And so in that kind of an environment, the financing costs of infrastructure are clearly at a relative low compared to really anything that I've seen during my lifetime. Now, does that mean that this should be a priority for the government? Well, obviously there are other types of infrastructure investments that they might consider making, and we don't have any horse in this race, right? So our task was to examine the alternatives of financing and funding. So we're not making an argument for or against this as a project. And as Tony said, as economists, there are other goals that governments might have besides economic efficiency, which essentially is this measure economists use to try to balance the costs and benefits of infrastructure investment. So we would expect that one criteria would be to suggest that this passes some kind of net cost benefit test, but that's only one way of evaluating projects, and there may be other considerations. And as I think it said on one of the slides, real governments are not necessarily only motivated by what is equitable or economically efficient. They have other goals, such as being elected the next time and maintaining power. So that could, present other kinds of cost-benefit calculus from the point of view of the actual decision makers.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I mean, there's no way you can talk about a project of this kind of magnitude without thinking about the politics of it, right? And I think a couple of our questioners are thinking about the politics of it, wondering if in a federal system like ours, having the federal government or some agent of the federal government be the assembler makes a great deal of sense, right? Constitutionally, they have responsibility for interjurisdictional and or national projects, which this obviously would be. Of course, there's always tensions in the federation between the partners, and certainly adding in the role of Indigenous peoples, it kind of creates a whole kind of political set of questions that people have. And I guess it starts with, are the economics compelling enough? Is this business case compelling enough to really overcome some of those interjurisdictional squabbles, or in fact overcome some of the disillusionment, frankly, that taxpayers have with mega projects? When we look at some of the other kind of government supported mega projects, hydroelectric plants like in Newfoundland, certainly some concern about support for major projects here in Alberta. Do we think the economics alone are going to be compelling enough to gain the attention of the primary assembler, which would be the federal government?
Well, do you want to go first, Mark, or Tony? I'm happy to.
Before you answer that, I just wanted to say there was a follow-up to the question. Somebody objected to my use of the term savers are willing to pay the government to hold their wealth at negative real interest rates. I didn't mean that anyone was going to like it. I just meant that in aggregate, if enough people want to save and not enough people want to invest, that's the outcome. And this seems, I mean, this is not my view, right? This is a view that's shared by a lot of people in the profession right now. People have been talking about a global glut of savings for many years now, right? And the aggregate effect of this seems to be that we have negative real interest rates, right? I'm not saying it's good or bad, right? We're just saying that's what's going on right now. Sorry, Aidan, you had a point?
Well, just in response to, are these worth it? History shows that economies of scale and economies of scope are real. In other words, and also history shows if you take a long-term perspective, which is more appropriate for government, historically, these things are valuable. If you look, say, think of what is a mega project, the London subway or the New York subway. Well, I'm sure if you look at them from a commercial perspective, they don't look great. But if you look back over 150-year history and you take low enough social discount rates, they were amazingly valuable and positive social projects, which is essentially what they were. So I don't know whether that applies to this one, but I mean, there's been a lot of talk about cost overruns, and we've written a lot about getting incentives right so you don't encourage that. But the history of many mega projects is not that bad.
Yeah, to add to that is that one of the things we looked at was the Channel Tunnel, which was a PPP and which did go through various stages of bankruptcy. So for the original investors, it was a terrible project. But if you take a long enough perspective and look at it from society's point of view, a lot of people argue, well, actually, it really was actually a pretty good project. So that's evidence to support Aidan's point about taking a long-term perspective.
Would you see a role here potentially for the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to take an interest in supporting the development of putting together the financing for this?
Well, I think it goes back to our distinction between financing and funding. Clearly, in terms of financing, they might well be very interested. And that would make sense. They are unlikely responsibilities to their you and me, right, who pay in, we're not going to be necessarily, well, we can't be interested in a 100-year time horizon because we're going to want our pensions. So they've got a role for financing, I would argue lesser role for funding.
You know,
Mark?
I was very interested in your critique of P3s as a financing, delivery model, because of course the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is very focused on using P3s to develop this kind of infrastructure. You talked about the risk transfer not being as efficient as people think it is. That interest rates are, in some cases, negative. And of course, P3 is having a very high transaction cost. So what's your view of, whether we should at this point be ruling out P3s, or, should we continue to consider it as part of the menu as governments currently do?
I'm going to defer to Aidan and Tony on this because they've published extensively in this area. So I know they've done a lot of research. I'll just say that the little bit I've done, the overall track record for P3s just doesn't look that great. And it's largely because of the much higher cost of financing. There is some debate about this, but we're fairly convinced that in a real economic sense, the private sector faces higher financing costs, largely because of risk that we feel they bear that the government as a whole can faces less of. And for them to have an advantage, they'd have to have an enormous advantage in having lower costs through their management. And that was the technical efficiency argument that Tony raised earlier. But as we said, the evidence, as I said, that Tony and Aidan have extensively researched, shows that P3s are only willing to bear construction risk, and you can get the same kind of incentives through design build contracts without bearing the additional financing cost.
I think one solution to this is there are many definitions of what a P3 is. And in the sense, the easiest way around this is to basically redefine a government fixed price design build contract as a P3. Then I think you could basically go ahead and do it. I think that the problem really arises in P3s where you have private sector financing putting up the money where it wants to earn a 7 or 8 or more % over a 30-year period, right, through availability payments. And it just makes no sense. And I think even PPP proponents have begun to realize this now and basically pay for the design build part of the P3 contract pretty much as soon as it's finished, which is really avoids having to pay the availability payments at a very high interest rates to the private sector.
Okay, so thinking about maybe the post-construction phase where pension plans might be more interested, one of our audience members suggests that really implicit in the discussion so far is that all the major investors would be Canadian. And certainly pension funds like CPPIB, they try to find infrastructure projects with ongoing streams of income in order to get the returns that they're looking for. And of course, maybe this makes this project of interest to other countries or foreign venture capitalists that might want to take advantage of what looks to be a great economic opportunity. The question here is do you have any comments about the desirability of the Northern Corridor project to foreign players?
Yeah, Aidan, you want to take that one?
Oh, you go. Well, I think our only response would be, what is the global evidence on other parts of the world and private financing? And there isn't much, right? If you look at where are the big corridors, there's European Union, TENT, TEN/T, which is what I would say is the major operational infrastructure corridor in the world. And that's basically funded and financed by the EU. And then we've got some Asian examples, and those are development banks, which in the end are basically consortia of governments. So we haven't seen much evidence of private financing or funding globally in terms of infrastructure mega corridor projects that I am aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, pension funds are interested in things like owning Heathrow, for example, right? Where, well, they thought that the cash flow was reasonably predictable. It turned out it's not so predictable, but they tend to like those sorts of projects. And where have they really been used? They've really been used in roads, and I think that's why Aidan was talking about the tent example. Pipeline companies, telecommunication companies, other users of this infrastructure, they're quite happy to put up their own money and get their own return for it. So the question is, well, where do PPPs and private sector financing step in? Well, largely where there are no profits, right? And basically, is that either government has to pay now, or it has to pay a PPP and pay later. And introducing the political dimension, which, as Mark said, we're not that naive to realize that politics is an important part of this, and political decisions are important, and governments generally would look after their current constituencies, right, and would rather deliver projects now and pay later. And that's what Aidan and I have written a lot about, is really sort of the political economy of public-private partnerships. So yeah, pension funds would be happy to be in if there's a nice steady stream of cash flows, but they are generally pretty risk-averse organizations, and if they do experience risk, they expect a high return. And basically, the risk-adjusted cost to government is much less than the risk-adjusted cost to these firms.
Great.
I should say that, implicit in all of this is this notion that the providers of the infrastructure are not going to be in competitive markets. So a point we discuss in the paper is that due to the nature of the costs of building a road or building a pipeline or building an electricity transmission grid, you have to spend all this money up front to create the infrastructure before you begin providing service. And as a consequence, it's much cheaper for one provider to provide all of the service than to have competing infrastructures built with fractions of the service on each one of them. So because they're all going to be in these sort of essentially monopoly positions, we would anticipate that they would be regulated, right? As we regulate hydro and other kinds of infrastructure like this already. So anyone's willingness to finance is going to depend on the return they expect to get, and that return is going to be conditioned on what they expect the regulators to do. And if the regulators are answerable to their constituents, then they're unlikely to allow, sort of, as we said, monopoly pricing, right? And so if as traditionally has been the case, the regulation is intended to ensure a reasonable return, that means they're not likely to make any excess profits. And so the interests of any financiers are going to be tempered by the fact that they're not going to, anticipate large returns necessarily, right?
But I mean, in my experience, even those regulated rate of return, I mean, they're healthy returns, and they're, a good use of investment capital in order to get those, kind of guaranteed long-term, kind of reasonable rates of return.
And just to add to that, that's why good institutional environments are so important, because people have to be able to trust the regulatory environment. And that's why in many countries where they can't, it's much harder to deploy that kind of capital, because in the background is always institutional quality as to the reliability of the regulatory framework.
Absolutely, Aidan. And I that was a question I was going to ask. Was part of your study suggests that your advice would be just to have this project regulated by the existing authorities. They have the most capability at this point to deal with, you know, the characteristics of this kind of an infrastructure investment. And I've certainly heard others suggest that there's no way that our existing regulatory framework will ever support another major project of this size. So what's your thought on that?
Aidan, you want to take that one on?
I'm not that cynical about the potential for this kind of project. With total realism about we're talking to get the thing going a 10-year or even a 15-year horizon. I think one has to be absolutely brutal in realism about the time horizon and the cost of these projects. And I'm not sure that that's impossible. I mean, the EU has actually managed to do quite a bit. And South Asia, they are managing to do some of this. Not vast amounts, which is probably good, but there are some things that certainly do have long-term social value, and the idea of a corridor is a fundamentally sound one from an economic perspective, and we have to keep pointing that out, I think.
Great. So one of the things I noted in your study, as did others, was in your review of the various international examples, you know, and including some of our own, like the St. Lawrence Seaway, you said you found no novel financing approaches. So people were basically taking a fairly, you know, traditional known approaches to financing these projects. Was there something specific you were looking for?
Oh, well, so go ahead. Go ahead. No, I was going to say that, you know, our terms of reference was to examine different potential sources of financing and funding. And, you know, so we tried to do that as systematically as possible. The case study evidence is, you know, not great. There aren't a lot of these projects to begin with. And then those that are out there isn't a lot of literature on. But from what we could find, you know, as Tony said, it did appear that there was usually, there was an entity that was involved in sort of assembling the property rights and providing them, and that was always either a federal government, supra-governmental organization, or multilateral development banks, and they almost always seem to provide their own financing. And then there, you know, there was as far as we could tell, some private financing involved in different components of infrastructure, but we didn't find any kind of really new approaches that we hadn't seen before that wouldn't traditionally fund those sorts of infrastructure.
Great. One specific question an audience member had was whether you had examined this specific case of the Hong Kong to Macau Zhuhai Bridge. It's a mega project they thought was comparable. Is that something that crossed your desk?
We were trying to look at sort of a dimensional corridors. So sure, we ended up with some that were less than ideal, but I didn't come across it. I don't know, Mark, whether you came across that one.
No, we didn't see that one.
Great.
I mean, those are relatively easy one because they've essentially got a pretty simple choke point, which allows you to toll stuff like that. And that makes it a lot simpler than the things that we're looking at.
Yeah, we did look at the Sydney Bridge. There was something in Sydney, but again, a no-brainer because of the numbers of people involved. Right, it's a highly dense population, relatively short distance. It's not like the Northern Corridor, which is a huge distances and a very sparse population.
So just the final question then, when we think about this project, you just basically touched on it, Tony. It is incredibly complex. You've got the federal government needing to be involved, absolutely provincial governments, likely Indigenous governments and Indigenous organizations. Then we've got private sector funders and a whole array of folks who want to be users of the service. So there's a tremendous degree of complexity. What is your view of our ability as a country, given where we are coming out of this pandemic and all the economic challenges we're facing? What is your view of our ability to tackle this kind of complex problem?
Well, I'm happy to respond. I think we have to recognize that Canada is constitutionally one of the most decentralized countries in the world. So for good or evil, and it's a mix of both. In many ways, this decentralization constitutionally is fantastic. It gives you many long-term benefits, but it has some costs. And one of them is, and the important word is constitutional decentralization, because other decentralizations can come and go, right? Constitutional ones in stable democracies don't come and go that much, they stay. And we're actually now getting a situation where First Nations and Indigenous groups have increasingly recognized constitutional rights. And that makes a huge difference, as we're finding out, right? Once the courts recognize constitutional rights, you now have an additional constitutional player, and you can't politically, at least you can't if you've got effective courts, override that. So we have a very decentralized constitutional system. So if we can't do it by cooperation, we're not going to be able to do it. Pure and simple. Other countries are not in that situation.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. I'd like to thank all of you for your terrific engagement with us and with the audience. I want to make sure I remind folks that we are going to pick up on some of these same issues at our next webinar on Tuesday, December 1st, where we'll be talking about the Cross-Canada Infrastructure Corridor, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and meaningful consultation. So thank you everyone for your engaging questions, and certainly the panel for your insightful responses. And I wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you, Marcia. And thank everybody. And I do recommend the other papers.
Absolutely.
Thank you.